today's chapter, we're going to talk about what are some biological and neurological factors that play a role in criminal behavior. So neuropsychological deficits, when combined with a wide variety of risk factors, are often found in antisocial or criminal offenders, especially those that are persistent offenders, serious offenders, violent offenders. So here's some definitions of some terminology we're going to use as we talk about neuropsychological factors. So one is self-regulation. That's our capacity to control and alter our behavior and emotions. It develops early, around age 2, has some genetic and some neurological influences, and is chiefly learned through socialization. Executive function, we talked a little bit about this in the last chapter. This is a higher level of cognitive functioning that plans behavior and executes goals. It's neurologically based. It's dependent on our prefrontal cortex, which we know is not fully developed until we're around 25. And malnutrition and toxins can cause deficits in this. It also involves our working memory, attention, response, and inhibition. Neuroplasticity is our brain's ability to change throughout our life. It's especially prevalent amongst young people because our brains are still developing. And it is still a feature, though, for adults. And motivation to change is important as people age. So those are just some terms to kind of keep in mind as we talk about this chapter. So when we think about genetics, what role do they play in antisocial criminal behavior? So first of all, there's behavior genetics, and that's the role that our genes play in forming and developing our behavior. And then molecular genetics is how the genes are actually structured and how they function at a molecular level. So genetics is pretty interesting in terms of the role that it plays in criminal behavior. And most of today's research is really looking at how does nature interact with nurture. Perhaps we're born with some predispositions or some genetic predispositions, and then your environment can either suppress those predispositions or trigger those genes and trigger that behavior. So when we think about genetics, right, there's 3 things to think about in terms of how it impacts behavior. One is your behavior attributed to genetic effects? Okay. Another area is influences of our environment that are shared by siblings, and then influences from experiences we don't share with other folks. So how do we separate out genetics from our environment? This is actually super hard to do. So one way we study this is to do twin studies, and there's also adoption studies. But twin studies do provide some support for the idea that some behavior may be genetic and may be inherited. Okay, so we have 2 types of twins: fraternal twins and identical twins. Okay, identical twins are monozygotic. One egg splits. So one egg is fertilized and then it splits, and identical twins share the exact same DNA. Fraternal twins are dizygotic. 2 eggs get fertilized at the same time. Okay. Now, there is a genetic predisposition to having fraternal twins, but not identical twins. So fraternal twins often run in families. Now, they're just like any other siblings genetically and DNA wise. Obviously, they gestate together and generally are pretty close. But otherwise, their DNA is no more similar than any other 2 siblings. So I have brothers that are fraternal twins. To look at them, you wouldn't even necessarily think they're brothers, let alone twins. And they are not very similar at all. Now, on top of that, we have shared environments and non-shared environments, right? So shared environments, prenatal and life experiences that affect both twins. Right? So when my brothers were growing up, all the way through high school, they went to the same school. In elementary school, all the way up to 8th grade, they went to a pretty small school. And so they were in the same classes, they had overlapping friends, they did a lot of the same activities. Those would be shared environments, okay? That promotes a lot of similarity, and it accounts for about 15 to 20% of variation in antisocial behavior. What the hell does that mean? Okay, when we do research, we can look at different variables and figure out what percentage of variability in some outcome it accounts for. So if we want to look at crime, what they're saying here is, or criminality, they're saying about 15 to 20% of the differences amongst people in becoming criminals is due to shared environment. Now, non-shared environment would be living experiences that are different. Did you go to different schools? Did you have different teachers? Maybe you weren't raised in the same home, okay? 30% of variation in antisocial behavior is attributed to this, okay? Now, the role that those things play, our genetic and our non-shared environments, increases as we get older. Now, one of the things that makes it hard to separate out like environment from genetic influences is how our parents treat us, right? So identical twins are so alike that they're probably treated very similarly by a lot of different people, and they probably elicit the same kind of responses from a lot of people, okay? So one thing that they look for is concordance. That's the degree to which pairs of subjects show a particular behavior or condition, okay? So early twin studies found heredity genetics to be a powerful determinant of intelligence, schizophrenia, depression, neurotic disorders, alcoholism, and criminal behavior. Now, the issue here is that these were not great studies. They had very small sample sizes, and there's better, more recent studies, and those do still continue to find higher concordance, like higher likelihood that both twins are criminals for identical twins, okay? They're sharing genetics and mostly sharing an environment. So there's a study done in the UK called the Twins Early Development Study, and it's a longitudinal study, so that means they follow the same group of people over a period of time, and they do this for 3 years in the mid-90s. So 13,000 pairs of twins. That's their sample size. N is the number in your sample size. They looked at behavior problems and problematic development in language, cognition, and academic abilities from early childhood through adolescence. And they said that heritability, genetics, plays a modest role in antisocial behavior, in particular with that callous, unemotional trait, which is a key trait of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. Now, in 2005, Jaffe and friends looked at the interaction of biological factors and environmental influences and basically found that a genetic predisposition, so maybe you've inherited a gene that could lead to being callous and unemotional. And then if you were abused, if you experienced maltreatment, that influences those genetic predispositions. That's kind of where modern biological theories for crime are currently, right? It's that we might have genetic predispositions. Think of those like a switch. You could turn it on or off, and that your environment could turn it on or off. Now, there's another data that looks at information from the Swedish Twin Registry. Now, you'll see in some research, right? I think it's either Denmark or the Netherlands. Does a lot of research with these really large groups, and that's because they collect national level health data, and so they're able to look at a lot of things, okay? So this study from Sweden is all male subjects, okay? And they looked at aggression in children at ages 8 and 9, and it's reported by the parent. And then 8 years later, they're asking them self-report of their violent behavior or aggressive behavior. And they found that genetic factors played an important role in early onset of aggressive behavior in children, but doesn't appear to play as big of a role in the development of delinquent behavior by male teenagers, okay? Early onset is important because we have a lot of research that tells us that as we enter our teen years, people start to like increase delinquent behavior. Then it's going to kind of level off and you're going to age out, okay? And that's like late teens. Um, those who become persistent adult offenders tend to start earlier. So that early onset is something to look for. As I mentioned, they also do adoption studies, right? And they try to compare like biological parents and biological children who have been adopted by somebody else. And so in 1972 in Denmark, they found that about 4% of biological relatives of psychopathic adoptees could also be classified as psychopathic, compared to 1%, 1.5% of the control group. Okay. But it's not statistically significant. What does that mean? It means it could be due to chance. It means this study does not mean anything. Okay. 1974, they looked at 52 people that were put up for adoption by female offenders. Okay. So their biological moms were female offenders. And they found the older the child was when they were adopted, right, placed with an adoptive family, and the longer the foster care placement, the more likely the child would be antisocial. Now, looking at some other data from Denmark, from Copenhagen, Hutchins and Mednick in 1975 found about 16% of adoptees had criminal records, compared with about 9% of people who weren't adopted. Biological fathers of adoptees were nearly 3 times more likely to be involved in criminal activity. When the biological father had a record and the adoptive father had no record, 22% became criminals. And when the biological father had no record and the adoptive father had a record, that was lower. That was about 12% became offenders. In another study, Mednick and Hutchins, along with a third colleague, looked at court convictions for adoptees and found that there was a statistically significant relationship between the conviction history of adoptees and their biological parents. And that's especially true for male chronic offenders. Now, one thing to keep in mind, these things are true, right? We have these findings, but we're talking about human behavior, and human behavior is complex. So it could be that things that lead to families or parents putting children up for adoption also could be things that lead to criminal behavior, could also be risk factors for that. So it could be that that it's not biology, that it is still environment, and that there is something that affects both. Now, this one's pretty interesting. This is something called the warrior gene, okay? It's MAOA. I forget what it stands for. You can Google it. Okay, and this is a gene that plays a key role in preventing antisocial behavior, okay? Now, some people have a low level of this gene. They have low MAOA. Okay, it's about 1/3 of the population. And this contributes to antisocial behavior in men. Okay, now this is where our theories and our research can get really specific. Okay, so this doesn't apply to women. Ladies, if you have low MAOA, I mean, I don't know how it affects the rest of your body, but it's not going to make you more prone to violent behavior. Gentlemen, it could make you more prone to violent behavior. Okay, and that's the genetic piece. But that's the switch. What's going to flip the switch is your environment. So it leads to antisocial behavior for men who have experienced ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And I can't remember as I'm recording this if I have this documentary on our schedule this semester. I've shown it in some other classes, but there's a documentary where they did some testing. They looked at like some dudes that were in like a motorcycle gang and some guys that were Buddhist monks, and they tested them for this gene and looked at like their past and things like that. And it's pretty interesting. There's no one gene that's like responsible for behavior. There's probably at least 7 genes that play a role in antisocial behavior. And usually the way that plays out is how it impacts impairments in your brain structure and how your brain functions. Now, we also need to think about the interactions between behavior and our nervous system, okay? Ways we test that, ways we measure activity in our nervous system are heart rate and skin conductance, okay? These are also tools that are used in lie detectors, okay? So lie detectors, polygraphs are not actually lie detectors. They're detecting how nervous you are. They're measuring your heart rate, your respiration, and skin conductance, okay? If you have low fear, then you would not, like, you would see that in these measures, okay? Low levels of arousal, low heart rate, low electrical skin conductance, generally result in, like, basically fearlessness, okay? People who don't have a lot of anxiety and fear, they don't really worry about getting caught or punished, and they find crime exciting and challenging because they're under aroused, right? So engaging in risky behavior is a stimulus for them. Okay? The amygdala is part of our brain, and it plays a role in regulating fear and other emotional responses. These are all things, too, that are linked to psychopathy and that callous, unemotional trait, right? And if you're callous and unemotional, then what you're going to do is you're not going to be thinking about other people's feelings. You're going to take the most satisfying, quickest, most immediate route to meeting your needs. And if that means stepping on people or being violent in the process, then that will happen. So it appears that physiologically speaking, psychopaths do not respond to fear the same way and often do not feel it the same way. Temperament is another biological thing. That's our natural mood disposition. You might have heard someone say, oh, so-and-so has a like calm and even temperament, right? Some people are just like chill most of the time. Temperament is assumed to have some sort of biological basis. We can see this in infancy. You can see this in babies, what their temperament is. Like you might hear someone say like, oh, my babies were all so good. They were calm. They didn't cry a lot. They slept through the night early. And it can also, though, even though some of it is biological, can be influenced by our environment. There's also environmental risk factors that then impact like our biology, our neurology, things like that. Okay. So some of these are like toxins that are just out there. And there's things that are out there that can really do some damage to like our brain development and then be linked to this. Okay. So these are things like trace elements, right? You're hearing a lot right now about microplastics, right? Tiny, tiny, tiny pieces of plastic that exist, like they're in the ocean, the fish eat them, you eat the fish, they're in you, right? You'll hear this about like not reusing water bottles and not heating up plastic, right? So like this kind of water bottle, right, can be leaking plastic into the water you're drinking, as opposed to like if you're using a metal cup or a reusable water bottle. So, right, a lot of people will be like, these are reusable. And technically they're not because of what happens with the plastics. Pesticides, chemicals, biological elements, things that have toxic effects on our nervous system. They can damage, destroy, and impair our neurons. And we are especially vulnerable when we're babies. We are I think the only mammal whose brain and does the majority, who's not only their brain, but their body. We do the majority of our maturing and growing outside of the womb. Okay. So like when babies are born, they don't have an immune system. Your immune system is not set and solid until you're like 5-ish, which is a little like scary. Right. Our brains are not fully developed. So it's really important that we're doing everything we can with babies to make sure their brain develops healthy. Okay. That's everything from like, what are you feeding them? And are you feeding them stuff that has the right nutrients for brain development? To like not smoking cigarettes around them, not using drugs or alcohol while you're pregnant or breastfeeding and passing that on to your child. So things that can play a role. One is lead. And we might talk a little bit more about lead in class. I'm definitely going to talk about it in another class because I just read a book where a woman proposes that part of the like heyday for serial killers in the 70s, that might be due to lead that was like present pretty much everywhere in the environment. You can't paint with lead paint anymore, but people's homes used to be painted with lead paint. And then like you're sort of ingesting that. And that can do actual damage to your brain and lead to violent behavior. It increases likelihood of ADD, increases crime, increases homicide. And so lead was like, it was in paint. That's the thing that people think about the most. But this woman's book, I forget what it's called. I'll figure it out before we have class together and tell you. Talks about like some locations that had a lot of serial killers during that time period, and we were still using leaded gas, and so that's leaking out into the environment in our cars. And that like maybe part of why we saw so many serial killers in the Pacific Northwest is because of like mines that had something to do with lead. I don't remember the details, but cadmium, when that's, violent offenders, when they test their hair, they find that they have higher levels of cadmium. This leads to learning disabilities, lower cognitive functioning. It's in almost every electronic device you use, and smoking. So when I was growing up, everybody smoked. Everybody smoked in front of kids, okay? There was a increase in the rate of asthma. So like if you look at Gen X people, they tend to have higher rates of asthma because of their exposure to secondhand smoke. Today, people are a little bit more like polite about that, and a lot of people are vaping as opposed to like smoking cigarettes, smoking tobacco. But smoking is a major source of cadmium. Manganese is in nuts, teas, legumes, and welding. It can cause brain impairment. That doesn't mean you can't eat nuts, guys. Okay. Poor emotional regulation, impulsivity. When there's too much of it in your nervous system, it can impact your brain functioning, your intellect, make you more aggressive and more violent, more impulsive, inattentive, defiant, disobedient, destructive, and hyperactive. Mercury can cause problems with memory, cognition, and learning. Mercury was in dental fillings, and you would hear a lot about mercury that's in the ocean and therefore in fish. Now, there's not a direct link to antisocial behavior with mercury, right? But you want to remember some of these things are not direct links, right? Like they're making an impact on your brain, on your cognition, which then impacts school, which then is a risk factor. And so here's that, list. So prenatal and postnatal nutrition is really important, okay? Now, this is going to tie in poverty in a second. So we know that our brains are continuing to develop till we're 25, right? And babies' brains are growing so fast and developing so fast once they're born, okay? And while they're developing in the womb, but once they're born. So it's important then, right, for them to have proper nutrition. Well, all the things that are the healthiest for you cost a lot more, right? Fresh fruits and vegetables. I don't know if any of you guys are like big fans of berries. I have a nephew who really likes berries, and my cousin was like, berries are like, all I'm hearing from parents are like, berries are so expensive. You know, they spend like $8, $9, $10 on a small thing of berries, and then their kid eats them all in one day, and the kid wants more berries, right? And it feels weird to say to your kid, like, you can't have a healthy fruit, right? But they're super expensive. Right? What is cheap in your grocery store? Look around and see. Like, go to a grocery store, look and see what's the cheapest stuff. It's like those Mama Celeste dollar frozen pizzas, right? That don't taste very good, but will do in a pinch. Right? Fruits, vegetables, chicken, eggs, all the things that are healthy for you, right, are very expensive. Barbados did a nutrition study, and they found high levels of antisocial behavior in adulthood when people don't have proper nutrition, and that this is a cumulative risk, that it adds up over time. Okay, it can impact your cognitive functioning. If you guys have ever seen like baby food, right? There's some baby foods. I can remember this from when my niece was little, and I think it said that it included like DHA, which is good for brain health. Okay, I just read that on a baby food package, right? But those are things to think about, right? Now, malnutrition alone is not going to turn you into a serial killer, right? But think about all these things that can be risk factors. If malnutrition impairs your brain development and makes it harder for you in school, and then you're failing in school, so you're feeling less than, and now you're rejected by other kids. So now you're hanging out with the delinquent kids. Like, these things can add up. We also want to think about toxins that we are exposing children or fetuses to, okay? So, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is some difficulties with neurological functioning. It can happen when parents are using drugs or alcohol while they're pregnant, while moms are. Nicotine can lead to slower brain development. When babies are exposed to nicotine in utero, they have twice the rate of adult violent offending. Okay. Now, just an aside with that, you have to think about what kind of parents are smoking while they're pregnant. Those kind of parents might pose other risk factors. Okay. This is a very strong relationship for boys, less so for girls. This is why we can't just study boys, guys, because things don't work the same way. Now, as I mentioned, it's probably an indirect effect. Mothers who smoke are more likely to be poor, less likely to be educated, probably lower social class, more stress during pregnancy, right? Smokers in general, right? This is like often linked to like impulsive behavior, right? And so they tend to have higher rates of antisocial behavior too. Okay. And then what are the effects of secondhand smoke? So like I said, I grew up and everyone smoked. Like ashtrays were in my house all the time when I was a kid. Probably by the time my brothers were born, like about 10 years after me, maybe mid 80s. My parents had quit smoking by then, but like my mom, my aunts, my grandparents didn't smoke. My dad smoked. All my aunts smoked. Like, there was just always cigarette smoke around us. We were probably very stinky babies. And then people sort of got to a point where it's like, oh, maybe we shouldn't do this in front of kids, right? There's a link between maternal substance abuse, so substance abuse by your mom, and substance abuse by then their children. This could be a shared genetic predisposition, but it can also be a result of modeling that kind of behavior, right? If you grow up in a house where you see people drinking a lot, you're not going to think drinking's bad, right? Or you might not think drinking's bad. Or if you see them using alcohol, tobacco, drugs as a coping mechanism, you might learn that as a coping mechanism. Okay. Prenatal cocaine use adversely affects emotional and attention regulation. We can also suffer a traumatic brain injury, and that can cause changes in our brain, and it can cause changes in our cognition, emotion, and behavior. It's often linked to violent behavior. About 60% of the incarcerated population probably has a traumatic brain injury. We are seeing the traumatic brain injury stuff as well with football, right? Football is the sport we're seeing it with the most as a result of like concussions. And if your traumatic brain injury is in the frontal lobe, right, that's where our organized thought, planning, and self-regulation are. So that can play like an even bigger role. And we're going to do some reading on the case of Phineas Gage. What about some abnormalities in how your brain develops? So again, that could be due to poor nutrition. What other stuff has your kid been exposed to? Have they been exposed to like communicable diseases? So things like HIV or rubella, right? Drugs, pollution, pesticides. The limbic system is a group of loosely connected brain structures and circuitry. And if that is not, if there's any sort of issues with that, that can play a role in offending. Same thing with the amygdala, which is a group of nerve cells that plays a role in learning, memory, and emotions. And impulsive aggression and violence are related to our amygdala. How do we know these things? Well, they do brain scans of people, and you can see different parts of the brain light up. We talked a little bit about plasticity. That's the idea that both the structure and the function of our brain can be affected by our experience. So infants not only need like good nutrition, but they need nurturing and sensitive care. They need stimulation. And it's very important in those early years, the first 3 to 4 years, to prevent antisocial behavior. Okay. By year 4, by the time we're 4, our plasticity for language development begins to decrease. It is much easier to teach your child another language up until the age of 5. Obviously, the younger you start to learn another language, the easier it's going to be, but especially up till the age of 5. All right, neurotransmitters, these are chemicals that are made by the brain. Oh my God, guys, I spell checked this before I started this. Why did it not catch that? And they are involved in our biochemical activity and transmitting messages in the nervous system. So you're familiar with some of these. Serotonin probably plays the most significant role in aggression and violence of the neurotransmitters. It's linked, low levels of serotonin are linked to aggression. Okay, remember, linked doesn't mean causes, it means linked. Okay, dopamine, norepinephrine, gamma aminobutyric. Wow, that was impressive. Okay, and then finally executive function, which we've talked about a couple of times now. These are higher level cognitive processes that organize and plan behavior. So this is your ability when you have like a big project to break it down into small parts, to plan ahead. Okay. It's your ability to think about consequences of your actions. It's very tightly involved in self-control, and significant deficits can lead to us acting without thinking, a lot of risky behavior and impulsivity.